welcome to a new episode of Coffee Chat and Book Review. I need to start out by saying my name is Leah, if you haven't remembered that. So I'm Leah. And for this specific episode, I need to issue a content warning, as the book we're discussing today and reviewing is called Let Me Prey Upon You by Breaking Free from a Minister's Sexual Abuse by Sandy Phillips Kirkham. And at the end of this review, I will be sharing an interview I did with Sandy herself, where she discusses her journey, what happened to her, the effects of it, and why this happens, and what we can do, what victims can do. So I was drawn to this book because I have been victimized by a variety of different types of perpetrators, mostly emotional abuse, but the ways that it doesn't matter what type of abuse is abuse. The methodology that perpetrators or people that are narcissistic personality disorders or sociopaths, they're different, two different things. They use a lot. They use the same methods that she described here. We've got grooming, we've got gaslighting, we've got manipulation. I'll make sure I have a full list right here of the different tactics that they use to maintain control over that victim. So if you have ever been abused, or if you know someone that has gone through something like this and you want to learn more about it, or you want to learn more about pastoral abuse, I would highly recommend that you pick up this book. Sandy writes in a very warm style and describing the actions. You feel as if you're there going through each of the moments. It's not like she's writing from her memory and looking back. There is an element of that, but as she gets in the chapter themselves, you feel as if you're experiencing it with her, and you hear her thought processes while she's abused, all along the way as this pastor takes advantage of her. And so it's very engaging. It's a good read. It's an easy read in the sense of that you want to find out what happens next. It's not an easy read in the content of it. It's devastating that this actually happened to her. And not only to her, it happens a lot. Not just in the Catholic Church either. I know that in the 2000s, a lot was coming out about past priest abuse and what was happening with that. But it happens all too frequently with pastors of other types of churches or other types of spiritual denominations. And it happens outside of the church. But this specifically is about more of a mainstream conservative fundamentalist church that she was a part of. And what she talks about is that in her experience of being a victim, is that the church took the side of the pastor and said, we need to forgive him and we need to care for him, and ostracized her and didn't give her the care she needs. And I know this all too well. I've experienced it. I've joined a church where the pastor had left because he'd been having an affair, is what they called it. And the woman who had been his victim and her daughter were basically cut off from the church. But the pastor was sort of sent away with his wife to get counseling, and was still talked about in high favor about how he was well loved, and was never discussed again in that way. I'd never met this man. I know he died in about 2015, and had also started another church in the same town, where he had once abused or had this affair at the church I had gone to in the past. There was also, same denomination, a big church in Florida. The pastor's name, it's pretty well known, Bob Coy, of I believe in Florida, Calvary Chapel. I want to say Fort Lauderdale. It had been found out that he was having an affair and had a bunch of other things happening within the church. What happened was that he was taken from that ministry, and they even were public about this, that he had gone to another church across country or wherever, somewhere else away from that place, and he was still counseled and he was still on salary with the church was still paying his salary. However, the woman or whoever he had victimized was not given the same consideration. So this happens. I myself have I never experienced the emotional or the sexual abuse from a pastor, but I am starting to realize that there was early grooming and manipulation happening that I was not at fault for. For many years, I believed it was my fault based on the fact that at the time I was experiencing a lot of mental health issues that I'd been holding in all of my life, and I was unable to hide them. And I believed it was my fault. I believed that I was at fault for everything that was going wrong in my life. And so until I was able to start working on myself and get out of that area and out of that man's grasp and move to another place, I was able to start looking at the effects of the church, and am now able to begin to understand that I was targeted, even if it never went past anything else. And that possibly if he was targeting me, there might have been previous victims or after me that got worse. I can't say that, and I can't say his name. I won't say his name. But I'm processing that and figuring out what I need to do. And a lot of that understanding came from reading this book and seeing the process that she went through as she was targeted and all this happened to her. How it all went, how it started in the beginning and continued until it ended, and the tactics he used. As well as I also interviewed Amy Nordhus, and I will include the link to that in the description below so that you can check out her interview and her book. It's very similar, about a Christian therapist that abused her. Those two books helped me to start to understand what was happening to me, even if it never went past. And even though it never went to the physical or sexual abuse, there was emotional abuse and control that was happening. So I think that if you feel that you're in an abusive situation, or if you ever have, this would be a great book to pick up and check out, and that you would know you're not alone, and you would begin to understand so that you wouldn't be a victim in the future by someone else. I will include all the links where you can purchase the book and that Sandy discusses in the description below, as well as a bio and all the fun things that you can check out Sandy. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Also, there was a little snag where you'll see where I thought we were going to run out of time, so I apologize for that, but it all worked out in the end. Thank you very much. Bye. So hello, please introduce yourself and tell us the name of your book.
I'm Sandy Phillips Kirkham. The name of my book is Let Me Prey, P-R-E-Y, Upon You.
Okay.
That's it.
So how did this book come into being? And please just describe your journey.
Well, the book came about, I was sexually abused by my youth pastor when I was 16 years old. The abuse lasted for 5 years, and eventually ended because his actions were discovered. It was a traumatic time in my life, obviously. And once the abuse ended, for me, it was like I just wanted it to be over and I don't want to have to think about it anymore, which doesn't really work. And so for 27 years, I kept this secret. My family didn't know, my husband, my friends. And it was a difficult 27 years. And we can talk a little bit about that later, but it was a trigger that I finally decided that I couldn't keep this a secret any longer. I actually, at one point thought, I'm going to go to my grave with this. I'm never going to let anyone know that this happened to me. But this trigger made me feel like I had to do something. And so that began the journey of talking about my abuse and the healing process that I went through. Part of that healing process was that I began sharing my story with a ministry called the Hope of Survivors. And oftentimes I would talk about my abuse and the trauma and the healing that I went through. And so many people would say to me, oh my gosh, your story is so compelling. You need to write a book. It would probably take me another 6 or 7 years before I felt comfortable enough to write the book. And that's when I wrote the book in 2019.
Yeah. Wow. And it's out here only a couple years. First of all, thank you for being brave enough to share this journey. And I have to also say, I'm sorry that this went through. It's not something that should have happened to you or anyone. That you said something that sparked curiosity with me is, why did you feel, can you talk a little bit about why you felt you were going to take the secret to the grave, or you felt that you needed to?
Well, as many victims do, we blame ourselves. We feel like we participated in this abuse and that we could have said no, or we should have done something, or we should have done something to tell someone and we didn't. And for me, I was 16 at the time when the abuse started. I was 21 when it ended. So I saw it as I had this affair with a married man who was my youth pastor. And that's how I saw it. So for me, it was carrying this guilt and shame of having committed this sin, of having had this affair. I never saw it as abuse. And so for 27 years, for me, it was trying to hide something that I didn't want people to know about me. And psychiatrists and psychologists will call this the imposter syndrome, where you believe that if someone really understands who you are and what you've done, they're not going to like you. They're going to think differently of you. They're going to judge you. And so for me, it was 27 years of hiding this secret so that people would never know what I had done.
So tell me about, how did that, obviously I've read the book and I know how it affected in those 27 years your life. How can you talk about that? How the secret that you were holding in played out in your interactions during those 27 years?
Well, first of all, I don't think secrets, big secrets, are healthy. And so it certainly affected me in an emotional way and sometimes physically. Because when you're hiding something, you always have to be vigilant. You have to be careful that no one's going to find out. And so there were situations throughout my life where I would think someone's going to find out about this. And so now I have to pretend or do something to make sure they don't find out. There were incidences throughout the book where, someone would mention something about church or say something, and I had to hide my anxiety. I had to hide my emotions. It was also difficult because I was married, happily married, but here I was hiding this huge part of my life from my husband. And again, I was fearful of the judgment. I was fearful, would he feel differently about me? Would he not understand why I wouldn't share this with him? Would he see me differently sexually? All of these things play into why hiding the secret is so important to victims, because we don't want to have to deal with the judgment, the consequences. And it's an unrealistic fear of how people are going to respond, but it's one we believe because our perpetrators early on tell us, don't ever tell, don't ever tell, you can never tell the secret. And that was embedded in my brain for years. We're also told that we're going to be blamed. They're going to blame you if they find out what we've done. And so that part hangs around and really clouds your judgment and why you feel like you can't tell anyone.
Yeah. I used to be, right, I was once going to a very fundamentalist church in my 20s. And I know part of that worldview is abstinence before marriage. So when you got married, did your husband believe that you had not had sex before marriage? And did that factor into why you kept that secret from him?
No, I don't think that was as much as a factor. He was 30, I was 24. I think, one of the gifts that he gave to me early on was, I don't remember the situation exactly what we were discussing, but I said something to the effect of, well, you don't know this about my past or something. And he said to me, if it happened before I met you, it doesn't matter. And so that gave me this gift to say, I don't have to tell him because he doesn't want to know, or he doesn't care if it happened before him. But that still didn't keep me from worrying about it and hoping that he would never find out.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the church obviously that I grew up in was a fundamentalist as well. And, losing my virginity was something that I knew was a huge sin. And to lose it in the way that I did made me feel even guiltier about what I had done and how I had participated in this relationship, which, of course, none of that is accurate or true, but that's the perception that I had.
Especially when you're so young and you hadn't had any real life experience other than the church.
Exactly.
You were just a baby.
And he would say to me, and this is also in the book, which I think is a horrific thing to have said to me, but many times he would say to me, you're no longer a virgin, so no one else is going to want you. And I'm the only one that can love you. And you're told that enough that I believed it. It was something that I knew that he was the only one that could ever love me, and that this was going to be my life.
Right. And a lot of times the rampant purity culture, the toxicity of that started more or less in the 90s. So I don't want to put anything out there, but this experience you're having was a little bit before that. So the whole, abstinence thing wasn't necessarily a factor.
Well, I it may not have been called purity culture, but it certainly was drilled into us that, the girl was responsible for making sure that she kept her virginity. And she was the one responsible for stopping any physical actions that he might be pursuing. It was always our responsibility. And it was always made clear that, being a virgin was the ultimate goal. And that if you weren't a virgin, then somehow you were tainted or talked about, and you weren't as worthy as those girls who had waited until marriage. It was very much a part of the church in which I grew up. And that's why when he took me into his bedroom that night, I was devastated beyond belief, because I knew now that I had lost the one pure thing in my life that I was supposed to keep pure, and didn't.
And such confusion, because it was from someone that had been telling you that you had, or
he'd been my spiritual guide.
The idea, and that he'd been so deceitful. He was being so deceitful and so confusing for you as a young woman.
And one of his sermons, and I vividly remember this, he talked about, the sanctity of marriage. Well, he's married, and obviously he's speaking about the sanctity of marriage while he's committing adultery. But one of the examples he used, he said he was on the beach one day and he saw this kid walking by with a t-shirt on that said, "Stamp out virginity." And he said, I walked right up to him and I said, "You take that shirt off, and someday when you think about it, you hand it to your daughter and see if you still feel the same way." And I can remember sitting there just being so confused by that, because he took away my virginity, and yet he's scolding this teenager for wearing a shirt that said "Stamp out virginity." So yes, there were a lot of confusing messages for me in that context of this pastor who was supposed to be my spiritual guide, and yet he was having sex with me on Saturday nights, giving sermons on sanctity of marriage.
Right. He had two different faces, and he was able, you were speaking about how hard it was for you to guard this secret. From what I read in the book, it wasn't very hard for him to live that double life. Would you think that?
Absolutely. He was a master at that. And part of perpetrators, they need to have that facade of being this great, wonderful person who would never hurt anyone, because that's part of the game as well. We avoid creepy strangers and people who seem a little off, or they seem a little weird or creepy, because, okay, I don't want to be around that person. But then you get around the person who seems to be this person who is caring and loving and is the pastor of the church, and our guard is down. We trust them completely. And that's not to say, I want to make it very clear, I believe that most pastors are faithful to their calling and would never ever do anything like this. But the sad reality is this is an issue in our churches. And whether it's a synagogue, the Catholic Church, Protestant churches, it happens in every denomination.
Yeah.
And we do need to start talking about it, and we need to start dealing with it in a way that doesn't help the perpetrator continue his behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. On that note, what is the frequency of sexual abuse in the church, and what are often the repercussions of when this is found out?
Well, I think there was a study done that 87% of pastors have admitted to being tempted, is their word, that they've been tempted. There was a study that said like 40% had said they'd looked at porn. So there's an issue out there with pastors for certain. The repercussions are endless in the sense that it harms the congregation. It destroys people's perception of God's word. Mm-hmm. And for me, as a victim of clergy abuse, it stripped away all the beliefs that I understood at one time, that church was a caring place, that there were people there that loved you and you could trust those in charge. Mm-hmm. His abuse stripped away those beliefs. He really contaminated the church for me in many ways. Prayer became non-existent for me. I was someone who prayed every day as a teenager. I took my Bible to school. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's important to understand that I was very involved in the church. I was just sang in the choir. I taught Sunday school. I did all of these things. That church meant everything to me. And when he violated me, he contaminated that part of my life for me, and he took away that spiritualness from me. The chapter I talk about that most is called Spiritual Wounds. Mm-hmm. And it's a deep, deep wound that occurs when clergy abuse occurs. Mm-hmm. If abuse occurs outside of the church, it's still horrific, but those people still have a place to go. They can return to the church. They can pray to God about it. I didn't have that any longer. It was taken away from me.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you think you were a target of his? What was it about you that drew him to you?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that most predators do target their victims. They look for victims who are vulnerable. They look for victims who maybe have prior abuse, dysfunctional families. They look for victims who have a acute crisis in their life, maybe a death in the family. I think for me, my vulnerability was the fact that my parents were divorced. Mm-hmm. I didn't see my dad very much. I felt kind of lost a little bit. And so church provided for me a safe haven. I loved going to church. And so that was the place that it gave me security. Mm-hmm. And I think he saw that in me. He tapped into that fact that I didn't see my dad much. So I saw him as a father figure. And everything he did up until the time he had sex with me, that's the way he pretended to be. He was always caring. He was always wanting to know how I was doing. When I was having issues with my family or my dad, he would let me come into his office and talk to him about it. And all of this made me feel special. It made me feel validated. It made me feel like I was loved and cared about. And so the first time he kissed me, I couldn't process it, because here was someone that I thought, this is this wonderful person who's always been helping me. And so for me, it was, I just misunderstood. This is just his way of showing how much he cares about me, because it was a quick, almost innocent type kiss. And that's the other thing perpetrators are good at. They're very good at slowly, methodically, before they get to a point where they actually have sex or control that individual. It's a subtle touch. It's a lingering hug, and it could be an innocent text that's sent, because they want to see how the victim's going to react and respond initially. And then gradually they start to push the boundaries a little bit more and a little bit farther, and that's the grooming process, so that the victim starts to accept behavior in this person that they wouldn't normally accept in another person. Mm-hmm. And that grooming process for me took over a year. And so I just saw him as this person who thought I was special and that I was getting all this extra attention that no one else was getting. And of course, I loved it. I mean, it was great. And then it turned ugly and evil.
Right, right. And then by that time, he'd worn you down so much. I was thinking about, and you discussed this in your book, I think a little bit. From my experience being in church, there was a church that I was attending, and right before I started going, they had a pastor fallout where it had been discovered that he had been having an affair on his wife and drinking. And my experience was that he had been asked to leave, but he then ended up pastoring somewhere else later on, and the woman was sort of ostracized. The woman and her daughter were sort of ostracized, in so much that the daughter eventually just left the church. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. That happens more frequently than you would want to believe. And even though my experience was over 30 years ago now, as I talk to other victims today, that is still kind of the case, where the pastor is given the most sympathy and the victim is blamed. And so in my case, when his actions were discovered, he was called into the office with the elders. He told his side of the story. I was never asked any questions. I was never called in. I was told where I was to sit in church, how I was to respond, because the whole goal then was to move him to the next church. And that took about 3 months. So for 3 months, I was under the thumb of these elders. At one point, I was called into the elder's office after he had left and told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And I was devastated. I was giving no biblical counseling. I was never asked my side of the story. He was very physically abusive to me. No one asked me anything about that. They really treated him in a much different way than I was treated. I can remember thinking, they forgave him and he moved to the next church, but I wasn't forgiven. I was told that I had to leave the church. And I think about that, and I often said that their behavior and their response from the church probably had more of a lasting impact on me than the actual abuse itself. It really told me that I was unworthy in many ways to be a part of a church, and that I wasn't worthy of forgiveness. And it's important also to note that I wasn't his first victim. Prior coming to our church, he had another incident where a young woman came forward and accused him of sexually inappropriate behavior. He didn't deny it. He said he was sorry, said it would never happen again. And within 6 months of that accusation, he was making a pass at me in my own home after a youth group meeting. So, and then he continued this kind of behavior throughout his career. I eventually confronted him. It was part of my healing. After I told my husband and my friends, it was something that I felt I had to do. It's not something I'd say I would recommend for every victim. You have to know yourself well enough if you're able to handle that. And I think also important would be to understand that the response you get from your abuser is probably not the one you're going to want. Because number one, they're not going to understand the damage that they've done. And so any apology is going to be very superficial, because they truly don't get what they've done, or they would have removed themselves from ministry instead of being forced out in some cases. So confronting him was a huge step in my healing, but his reaction was disappointing to me. And I should have been prepared for that, but I wasn't.
But it was very brave, and it was very brave of you to do it. And it did continue the healing process.
It did. And, it was very nerve-wracking for me. I was very nervous. I was scared. I really worried that I would walk into that room and be 16 all over again, and he would be able to manipulate me and to get me to acquiesce to his feelings of I'm sorry. And when I confronted him, instead of acknowledging my pain, he then went on to a tirade of why he was the way he was. He'd had an alcoholic father, and that he'd been identified as a sexual addict in therapy. All of these things were about him, and why he did what he did, opposed to acknowledging that it was something he should never have done.
Yeah. Yeah. And that siding with the abuser and blaming the victim, and this blaming the woman, it goes back to that sort of purity culture mindset. The woman is responsible for the man's falling, whoever it is.
Yes.
The woman somehow, is the Jezebel.
And somehow he was so tempted he couldn't help himself. You know, this isn't just about a moral fall. I mean, this is someone who's methodically gone after someone. You know, people see this as just simply an affair. It's not an affair. It's an abusive position and a power that he's in. You know, when someone is spiritually has control over another individual by their words, then you trust that person, and then he's taken advantage of that trust by abusing that individual. And sometimes I've talked to some victims, and they'll say, well, you know, I was never asked to leave the church, or I was never told I have to leave the church. But they would say things like, well, you know, ever since this has happened, it might be better if you found another church, or it's probably uncomfortable for you to be here, so maybe it would be best if you moved on. So it's kind of those subtle ways now, instead of just point blank saying to another victim, you need to leave.
Right. And it goes along with, well, this is your family. These are the people that were supposed to give you, that said they're going to give you unconditional love. Right. And then instead, when it gets tough, just leave, so we don't have to pay it. We don't have to see it.
And it's easier to blame the victim. Think about it. It's easier to blame her and rally around him. You know, I somewhat understand, in the sense that this is a man who's baptized their children. He's married their kids. He sat at their mother's bedside when she was dying. So they have a personal connection with him that they don't want destroyed. And so it's easier then to say, well, you know, he shouldn't have done this, but look what she did in order to entice him, or what she did, and she should have said no to him, and she could have done this, or she should have done that. You know, I've been asked so many times, well, why don't victims say no? And my question back to them is, what is he doing putting her in a position of having to say no? You know, there is no reason a woman going to church, or a child who's in church, should ever fear that she's going to have to rebuff her minister because he's made a sexual advance toward her. That shouldn't be a part of why you're in church. And no matter what the situation is, it is always his responsibility as the one in charge to maintain those proper boundaries. No matter what the situation is, he's the one that needs to retain those proper boundaries.
And also as an adult. Yeah,
exactly. And if he can't, then he needs to find another job.
Yeah. So what was I going to say? I thought there was a thought in my head, but I'm going to move on. So what advice do you have to others targeted? Specifically for myself, something that I'm processing in my recovery and therapy. I have been years of more of emotional abuse, from family of origin to you know, ex-husband and friends, and then also the church that I was a part of. And I've pretty much healed from a lot of that spiritual abuse, but there's something that I'm still triggered by, or is there in my head, is that I never experienced the pastoral abuse that I experienced, never went beyond, never became anything physical in any way. But I'm starting to believe, as I read your book, and then I read Amy Nordhaus's book as well, and reviewed that, I started to see that with this particular pastor, there were certain things he was doing that were grooming me, or, you know, playing games with me, that even though it never got to that point, it was starting. So for a person like me that maybe have that memory, or finds himself in a situation like this, what advice do you have? I mean, what advice do you have for that?
Well, I think if you're in a situation that seems uncomfortable? Or the question I always put to people is, if this behavior were to occur with another individual, would you accept it? If your pastor or someone in a spiritual position of authority makes a comment or says something to you, or is constantly berating you for whatever reason, is that behavior you would accept in someone else? Are you only accepting it because he's the pastor or the priest or the rabbi? Do you tend to say, oh, well, I must be too sensitive because this is the pastor and he wouldn't ever say anything that he shouldn't say or do because he's the pastor?
Mm-hmm.
But if you took that same situation and moved it out of the clergy position, do red flags appear? And if they do, then that behavior it's not right. There should not be that kind of behavior occurring within the church, and certainly not between a pastor and a member of his congregation. And it's hard too, because these men are very clever. They're not overt about, their abuse, verbally or emotionally or sexually. They're very subtle about it. And so it's a game they play. It's a game, and they're very good at it. And so it's difficult to see those warning signs and those red flags. And again, we don't want to start accusing our pastors of, doing something wrong or bad because it's the pastor. And that's certainly why I didn't say anything in the beginning, because I just assumed that this could not be what he's doing because he's the pastor. Mm-hmm. And eventually, when it came to the sex part of it, he made it very clear that no one's going to believe me. Mm-hmm. And I can remember thinking, I wouldn't believe this either, because it's happening to me and I can't believe it. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I answered your question quite fully enough, but yeah, I don't know. So
that's fine. I do have another question. Something that I've often thought about within the confines of the church I was in is that two things were discouraged. We're running out of time. I'm gonna hold on. We'll think about that when it happens. Anyways, when we run out of time, I'll restart.
Okay.
I'll make this work. Anyways, okay. So so when it comes to the confines of the church that I used to belong to, two things were strongly discouraged, was higher education and any kind of mental health or psychological help. Mm-hmm. And so I think about how, and that when they chose their male pastors, they'd often kind of, the leadership when they were growing up, they would, raise them up in the church, and they would start to kind of groom them in a way to become, and lift them up as, you're going to be chosen by God. And I often think that this was a person that had been raised in the church, not seen much else, not learned a lot of critical thinking skills.
Right.
Had people tell them how great they were for many, many years. And then they came into this position of power, sometimes as a very young man. And then on top of that, they, the church itself, when they get into situations like this, they don't have a lot of the psychological
skills. They don't have skills to deal with it,
work through it, and to use their own critical thinking skills to decide, well, one person isn't good and the other evil. There's shades of gray, or they don't even understand what, a perpetrator or a narcissistic personality disorder, a sociopath. It's not even in their worldview. Is there something you can speak about that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The church is not equipped to deal with this kind of behavior for a number of reasons, and you pointed some of them out. In my case, he was a narcissistic sociopath. He didn't have any remorse, but his persona to the church was completely the opposite, and so people could not see through that. And one of the things you'll hear church people say as well, he was never just demonstrated any kind of behavior like that around me, and he was always above board, and that's not the person I know. And so that's one issue. And then you got the other issue of, I think what happens is they use the Bible as an excuse then to not discipline or have consequences for this individual. So in other words, well, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. and God forgave you, so you should forgive him. It's not our place to judge. All of these things, which I consider misuse of scripture in these situations, lends itself then to handling the situation inappropriately. So I'm not judging whether this man is a good person or not. I don't think he is. I'm not judging, though, whether or not he's getting to heaven or not. What I do judge these men on is whether they're fit for their position. I'm judging whether by their behavior that they've just demonstrated that they're not fit to be in the pastor position. So, and then when people talk about forgiveness, look, I don't know whether God will forgive my abuser or not. That's not my place. And he deserves forgiveness from God if he demonstrates repentance. But forgiveness does not mean he remains in ministry. You can still forgive a pastor or a priest or a rabbi, and that pastor, priest, or rabbi is forgiven sitting in the third row of the church. Yeah. Now, if it's an abuse of a child, they should not be anywhere near that church. People get really upset when I say things like that. Well, they deserve to have communion with God and they deserve to be back into the church. No, they don't. The people, they repeat this behavior over and over again, and they cannot be trusted to be around children. Right. I've had one church say to me, well, we had an incident and we put him in the church basement in a room, and we allowed the TV of the news, the feed going back from the pastor sermon to this TV in the basement. You can take steps like that, but they are never, ever, when children are involved, to be around children again in the church. And again, this is not about saying that they can't be forgiven. It's not about that you can't say that you want to get them help, but it is about saying they should be removed from ministry and never have that position again. By their own actions, they've lost that privilege. They've lost that privilege. I, as a nurse, if I'm caught stealing narcotics, I lose my license to practice. A stockbroker who is found with insider trading, he loses his license to be a stockbroker. There are consequences to every behavior. And when you're in a position of authority or in charge of something and you betray that trust, you lose the right to be in that position ever again. And so I know that sounds like a hard stance to take, but that's the position that should be taken by churches. I think the other problem churches have is that they only see it as a moral fall. They see it as a moral failing. They don't see the professional violation. He broke the ethics of his profession. So again, on the moral side, if you want to forgive him, if you want to give him help, whatever. But professionally, he's lost that privilege. Right. And I would also say, and I'm going to ramble here a minute, but I would also say that if you're going to provide help for the pastor and provide counseling and financial help, you darn well better be at least doubling that amount to the victim.
And they don't often do that.
And no, it's rarely done.
Yeah, if ever.
It's always, we need to help the pastor. We need to help his family. We need to get him counseling. We're willing to forgive him, but he needs help. And here sits the victim on the other side, devastated and with a lifelong impact. And
ostracized.
Impact. Yes,
ostracized
absolutely.
Most. So let's just close this up with, where can your book be purchased, and where can people, if they want to reach out to you, where can they do that? How can they do that?
My book is available on Amazon, but it's also available on my website, which is simply my name. It's a little long, but it's Sandy, Sandy Phillips, Phillips, Kirkham, KIRKHAM.com. That's my website. It's a little long. But if you Google my book, my name is on the book if you forget, but that's my website. I would encourage people who who have either been abused or someone who just wants to understand clergy abuse a little bit better. There's a lot of good information on the website. I also have on my website and in the back of the book a bibliography of books that I think are very good for people who have been abused or those who want to understand the topic a little bit better. I would encourage, everyone to read my book. I do think it's a fascinating story. As you well know, there's a lot of twists and turns in the story, but my hope was in writing the book that it would provide a blueprint for people to understand how someone can for 5 years be caught in a relationship with seemingly no way out, and why I waited 27 years to finally tell anyone. And there are a lot of books out there, as I said, that are very helpful that I would encourage people to read. But and let me just finish with one last thing. I want to say to victims, one of the things that helped me and I need for victims to understand is what was done to you was not your fault in any way. There is no way you should have any shame or guilt or blame. You handled the situation the best way you knew how with the coping skills that you had at the time. And it's easy to look in that rearview mirror and say, I could have done this, or I should have told someone. But at the time, you were being controlled and manipulated and abused by an individual that you should have been able to trust. And that changed who you were and how you could respond. And so I say to victims, please, please, please don't ever carry that guilt and shame. It's not your guilt and burden to carry. And secondly, I would say educate yourself. Learn the terms grooming, gaslighting, manipulation, because once you're able to see how he did these things to you, or if it was a she, sometimes women are abusers as well, it opens your mind and your heart to understand that you were targeted and you were used, and that you didn't really have control over the situation. And finally, there is hope and healing. I am proof of that. It doesn't mean that I have forgotten my abuse. It doesn't mean that I don't have moments where I'm triggered, but there's hope and there's healing.
Okay, thank you very much.